We hear this parable today, of course, of the rich man and the poor man, Lazarus. Of course, on this immediate, obvious level, there's a lesson about caring for those in need around us, being attentive to the needs of the poor. When I was in college, I remember it was very much in college where I had exposure to or experiences of poverty in the world and in our country through different service trip experiences and just through learning about the world in different classes that analyze those kinds of things. And it led me very much to wrestle with the question of where is God in the face of all of this? So in human suffering and my conversations with a homeless man on one of my service trips, I was kind of faced with the question, well, what difference does Christianity make? You know, whether this man believes in Jesus or not, he still seems to be homeless on the streets. So I even kind of went to an extreme for a few weeks of really beginning to question, the relevance of Christianity, and if God or Christianity is irrelevant in the face of human suffering, then this whole religion thing seems kind of like a waste of time. Why are we spending all these resources in worship of God when there's homeless people on the streets? But as I wrestled with that question, my sort of compassion for human suffering is the very thing that brought me around sort of back to God. Because I realized if God wasn't real and if God wasn't part of all of this, then all we human beings really are just a pile of molecules. And really, in many ways, not much different than a pile of rocks. We're a little more complicated pile. But if all we are is just a physical compilation of molecules, what makes us any different than a pile of rocks or this or that? What makes the suffering of a human person or any different than the suffering of any other material thing? But I realized that there was something that I knew deep down that I didn't believe that I did in fact believe that there's something about human beings that set us apart as distinct and different from all the rest of creation. There's something about this pile of molecules that's different than a pile of rocks. Something that must be a non-physical thing. Really, what I was philosophically approaching was essentially the existence of a soul. That human beings do, in fact, have this inviolable dignity, and that I believed that. And therefore, if human beings have some spiritual thing that sets us apart, it kind of led me back to, then there must be a spiritual world and God. And so it is, in fact, one of the tenets of our faith that every human being has this inviolable sacred dignity, the inviolable sacred dignity of every human person, including and especially the least and the most vulnerable. And there's our teaching, our moral teaching as Christians, as Catholic Christians, has this consistency, the inviolable sacred dignity of every human person from conception until natural death and everything in between. And I'm not aware of any other institution that teaches that full, consistent ethic of life. Every human person, the least, the most powerful, the least powerful, the most vulnerable, the smallest, from the moment of conception until natural death, has an inviolable, sacred dignity that is to be respected and not to be violated. Now, respecting human dignity doesn't mean we have to agree with everyone's choices, that it doesn't mean we have to condone all their behaviors. It doesn't mean we can't call out bad choices or lifestyles. But it does mean that every life is sacred. But this isn't meant to just be merely an individual, a private attitude. But the church actually gives us guidance then of how this then plays out in the social realm. That included in our morality as Catholic Christians, more than just a private belief, is that what we believe has social implications of how we order a society that is just and good. And so there's principles that guide us in that. In the late 1800s, there was kind of these massive social changes that happened with the Industrial Revolution. And with that, the Pope at the time, Pope Leo XIII, saw all of this and saw in these vast economic and social changes the need to represent, in a way for this changing world, the teachings of Christ, to remind us of how we're to organize ourselves, particularly with an eye towards that respect of human dignity. He wrote a document called Rerum Novarum, which became the foundation of what is now known as modern Catholic social teaching. And since then, popes have continued to write and built upon this in our ever-changing world, especially in our relationship with technology and how that transforms the world. And so in that body of teaching, there's been some theologians who have kind of boiled it down to 7 main themes, because we in the Catholic Church really love lists of 7. There's 7 sacraments, 7 works of mercy, 7 virtues, 7 deadly sins. So, of those themes of Catholic social teaching, I want to highlight 2 here. One that I already mentioned, that's sort of foundational. One of those principles is precisely the sacred dignity of every human person, and how that is to then inform how we shape and order society. That we can't just see a minority of people as expendable for the good of the majority, but that every human person is made in the image and likeness of God and has a sacred, inviolable human dignity. Which, by the way, it's worth highlighting how radical of an idea that is, that was introduced in the world by Judaism and Christianity. Because we think about, back in the times, say, of Christ, the Roman Empire, this idea of a social welfare program or care for the poor didn't exist. If you owed debts you couldn't pay, you sold yourself into slavery. And that would, or you could be a beggar on the street. And those were your options. But there was no sense of care for the poor. Or certainly in the powerful Roman Empire, one of the most powerful empires the world had seen up to that point, there certainly was no sense that the divine, God, would associate himself with the least and lowly in society. The divine God was always associated with the king, the emperor, the powerful. The emperor himself was seen as a divine God. And so this radical idea that was brought into the world through Judaism and through Christ, that the poor, the most vulnerable, there the divine associates himself. As he says in Matthew 25, Jesus says, "Whatever you did to the least of me, you did unto me." So this leads us to then, not only the sacred dignity, but the other theme I wanted to highlight of Catholic social teaching, what we call a preferential option for the poor. That is essentially to say, this preferential option, that it's precisely that we as Christians have to have a particular eye towards the poor, the powerless, the most vulnerable, because they're the ones that tend to get overlooked. Literally stepped on or literally ignored, or sometimes stepped over. We hear in the gospel today, right, that Lazarus lied at the rich man's doorstep. He literally stepped over him. So little did he pay attention to him. Now there's, of course, room for discussion of how particularly that plays out on a social level and how these resources are provided. But that it's a call, how do we organize ourselves, not just as individuals, but as society, to look towards the poor and those in need. And here in the Archdiocese, we have a list of ministries that do that. And I won't go through I could go through a whole long list of several, but just to name a few, of course we have Catholic Charities, that extends our social services, our charitable organizations to the diocese. I was also blessed to work with a young man some years ago as a priest. This young man who graduated from college, and what did he want to do? He felt called to start what was called a Catholic worker house in Ames, Iowa, now called the Romero House. Here he was, a starry-eyed young man, fresh out of college, had his degree, but rather than going and pursuing a high-paying job, which he certainly was gifted enough to do, he saw the need of creating a space for the poor, and for the poor to encounter the church. So right in Ames, Iowa, the Romero House started about 6 or 7 years ago. This house that now where the poor can come and people from the church come and have lunch with them, providing a space for them. They host them and also have Bible studies for them. A place where they can be loved and cared for. Because sometimes we make the mistake that poverty is only about money, when really a lot of people who are impoverished in so much more than material ways. St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta was keyed into that. How poverty wasn't just about money and resources, but this impoverishment of love, of people who just feel totally abandoned, alone, and unloved. And that she saw as the even greater poverty. And she who worked with the materially poorest of the poor in the world would come to places like the United States and was very struck by that. Because you have all the resources in the world, but there is this great impoverishment, a spiritual impoverishment of love, where people are lonely and anxious because they don't know the love of Christ. So how do we live into that? There's also been a couple ministries in our diocese that have seen the importance in caring for, like I said, life in every stage, from the moment of conception, but not just in looking for the child, but supporting single mothers or women in need. In Dubuque, there's a place called Mary's Inn, started by Catholics, precisely for single mothers who feel they have no other resources to come, to have community, to be loved and cared for, and support them in their journey of giving birth to their child and beyond, in raising a child as a single mother, and many more besides. Those are just naming a couple. I won't give you the whole list, but if you're interested in learning more about things going on in the Archdiocese, I'd be happy to share more. But to know that we have this call for the poor, and to know that right here in our diocese, there's beautiful ministries that are happening. Not only in attending to the material poor, but sharing with them the love of Christ. So as we hear today this gospel of the rich man and Lazarus, how is the Lord calling us to be more attentive to the needs of others? The impoverished, the most vulnerable, those who tend to get overlooked. And maybe it's not the materially poor, but maybe those impoverished in other ways. The lonely, the overlooked, the anxious. And as St. Mother Teresa said, how are we called to bring the love of Christ to those places of impoverishment? We hear this parable today, of course, of the rich man and the poor man, Lazarus. And of course, on this immediate obvious level, there's a lesson about